Hi Internet! Welcome to the Gredtroyan YouTube channel. To celebrate the release of Final Fantasy XVI, I decided to release 16 videos ranking the Final Fantasy games in a variety of categories. Each game has their strengths and weaknesses, so I thought it would be a fun way to compare and contrast the games. These lists are just my personal opinion, trying to balance objectivity and personal preference, and likely failing to satisfy anybody. So, if you disagree with my ranking, which you probably do, let me know your ranking of the subject in the comments below. For this ranking, we're going to look at the intros for each of the mainline Final Fantasy games, plus tactics, to see which one hooks you into the game the best. For some of these games, I'm going to focus on the opening cinematic cutscene, and for others, I'm going to focus more on the opening in-game events. It's a bit of a judgment call in terms of how much I'm choosing to consider factoring into the intro, so some will include a decent amount of gameplay, while others may just be an opening movie. Each game does things a little differently, but this list will let you know what works for me and what doesn't work for me as much. I'm expecting some controversy over how much of each game I consider to be part of its intro, with some games just being an opening cinematic, and others I might consider the intro to be an hour or so of gameplay. There's going to be a lack of consistency that's opening up the floor for debate, and I acknowledge this up front, but I will do my best to be as fair to each game as I can in what I consider to be the intro. Again, it's my personal opinion, so take it with a grain of salt. Also, maybe spoilers, I guess? I feel like the very beginning of a story shouldn't count as a spoiler, but you never know with the weirdos on the internet and things they like to complain about. Alright, now that we've gotten all the preamble out of the way, let's get on to the ranking. Number 16, Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII's intro turned me off immediately the first time I played the game. Honestly, nothing in the series has come close to the terrible first impression that this game gave me. I had never been so actively angry at the intro to a video game before, and for that reason, it's a pretty memorable experience. But even as my tastes have broadened and I've learned to appreciate a lot of the great things the game has to offer, 12 still easily has the worst intro in the main series. The game begins with a pretty cutscene, but there's not much context to what is happening. There's constant shifting tones in the introduction of 12, and it's hard to develop any emotional attachment or meaning to anything happening on screen. There's some narration about politics, but spoken in high prose, and not enough context is given for the scenario to give the viewer any stakes or interest in the conflict. It all comes across as gobbledygook, and is a far worse offender than the infamous lore dumps in Final Fantasy XIII. It's not that the lore and dynamics are overly complex, but they're told in such a manner where it literally means nothing to the player. We then move on to the opening sequence, where we are introduced to Rex, our wide-eyed protagonist set about trying to do good in a harsh and cruel world. That's fine, he seems like a likable enough chap. It's at this point I discovered the battle system was a single-player MMO with no music, and given that gambits, the only good thing about the combat in 12, aren't an option at this point of the game, you're left with the most boring and bland combat the series has ever seen, in terms of visuals, music, and gameplay. Then Rex dies, which is a cool twist, but further adds to the idea that nothing you're seeing matters before rushing you along into more high prose that you're not given enough context for on an initial playthrough, and then, finally we get our real main character Vaan, leveling up fighting rats in the sewers, and the game actually begins. The intro is messy, convoluted, full of jarring shifts in tone, and lacking any kind of cohesion or context for the events unfolding. If you go back and watch the intro after playing the game, it makes sense, but there's no hook to grab the player initially. Other games might have intros full of mystery and intrigue, but in those games you are immediately interested in figuring out what everyone is talking about. In 12, it's an exposition dump, attempting to explain things but generally failing to do so in a compelling way. While it was a nice twist to play as Rex, the whole affair ultimately leaves a bad taste in your mouth after all the other problems with the intro. Kingdom Hearts 2 did have a main character switch in a more compelling way by giving you time to care about Roxas before moving on to playing as Sora. But you get, 10 to 15 minutes playing as Rex? Doing the most boring JRPG combat ever before just killing him off? It sucks. It really, really sucks. When I played Final Fantasy XII with my wife, I knew how bad the intro was, so I had her leave the room until I got to the part with Vaan in the sewers, and you know what? She fully understood the game and generally enjoyed it. The entire intro sequence could be skipped, and you could just start the game with Vaan in the sewers and learn all of the context of what happened in the intro through the main story without ever needing to see it, and the story works perfectly fine, if not better, without that muddled mess of an intro. In my opinion, the intro needed either massive cuts or needed a lot more context added, because the way it is, it's the worst of both worlds. The intro of Final Fantasy XII detracts from the game and immediately puts a bad taste in your mouth. It's, by far, the worst intro to a game in the main series. Number 15, Final Fantasy I. Final Fantasy I just kinda starts. There's a very brief text crawl that basically just says the elements of the world are messed up, and like Bonnie Tyler, the world is holding out for a Jim Steinman-esque hero. After the text crawl, you pick your character classes, name them, and then you're just unceremoniously plopped into the world and begin your adventure. The opening sequence of the game is the player discovering that the princess has been kidnapped, so you go and save her from the villainous knight Garland. And then the game reveals that your adventure is only just beginning. It's a cool twist that saving the princess, often the final and ultimate goal of a fantasy story, is just the intro, as it helps give the adventure a grander sense of scale. But just being plopped into the world isn't too satisfying and feels empty compared to later entries in the series. It's not actively bad like 12's intro, but it's not actively good either. It's just actively okay. There is an opening cinematic for re-releases of the game that features the Warrior of Light character design, who became an emblematic mascot of Final Fantasy I, battling against a dragon, and it's about as generic feeling as a lot of Final Fantasy I. It's fine, it looks pretty, but it's not interesting. Again, not actively bad, but not actively good either. The intro to Final Fantasy I is fine, I guess. Number 14, Final Fantasy V. To be honest, the intro of Final Fantasy V isn't really that interesting either, but there's more of an intro here than Final Fantasy I, and it's not actively bad like Final Fantasy XII's intro, so it's able to pass the low bar those two games have set. The opening in-game cinematic is structured fairly well, showing little glimpses of our four heroes scattered throughout the world as the wind mysteriously stops due to the destruction of the wind crystal, followed by a meteor crash to the ground and our POV character Bartz going to investigate. Thus begins the game. The intro feels a little RPG makery to me, if I'm being honest, which isn't necessarily a compliment here. While it's nice to see little bits of the world and our four main heroes, you're definitely not given enough of any of them to feel any kind of connection or general spark of interest to see as to why they might be. The inciting incident of the meteor is okay. It's better than one just dropping you into the game with nothing. It's not super interesting or done in a super interesting way, but it's better than literally nothing. If you want a meteor falling to the ground as an inciting incident in a SNES JRPG, Earthbound, quite frankly, did it better. 5's intro is fine for a run-of-the-mill Super Nintendo game, but it's not up to the high standards set by JRPGs and other Final Fantasy games on this list. The PlayStation version offers a CGI cutscene intro that's basically just a random collection of imagery from the game, but it's done closer to Amano's artwork than the in-game graphics, which are so disconnected that the intro becomes largely incoherent for a first-time viewer, and the music choices in the intro are cheesy and kinda bad. It's not a good intro, but thankfully the in-game intro is decent enough to rank above 12 and 1. Number 13, Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III, like Final Fantasy I, begins with an opening text crawl before dumping you right into the game, but unlike 1, you're immediately thrown into an interesting situation. The player has fallen into a mysterious cavern after an earthquake. There's immediate dialogue that reflects a combination of fear and curiosity, complemented by great music that enhances the feelings of both emotions. There's a part of you that wants to escape this treacherous place and return home, but there's another part, like a sailor to a siren, that wants to explore and wonders what kind of treasures you'll find within. It's a simple opening hook, but unlike the previous intros, it's extremely effective, and we're at the first genuinely good intro on this list. It's not top tier for the series, but it is definitely a good intro. If you wanted to be pedantic, you could argue the entire opening section up to defeating of the Jinn boss and seeing the opening credits is the true intro of Final Fantasy III, but that can easily be more than an hour of gameplay, and that's more of a completion of an opening arc of the story than an introductory sequence. For me, the intro is the sequence inside of the opening cave, finding the magic crystal, and discovering that you are a warrior of light and obtaining the power to save the world. In Final Fantasy I, the characters are just warriors of light from the very first second of gameplay, but in Final Fantasy III, you get to witness that transition, and it makes for a far more effective story hook. Also worth mentioning is the CG intro in the 3D remake of Final Fantasy III. It's actually pretty darn good. The characters look great, you get to see glimpses of their personalities, great renderings of iconic locations and moments from the game, and the version of Eternal Wind playing in the background is top-notch. It's actually one of the better CG intros for the series and holds up extremely well. Number 12, Final Fantasy XV. Like Final Fantasy XII, the introduction to Final Fantasy XV is multi-stage rather than a single introductory sequence. The first stage of 15's intro is a flash forward to an exciting action set piece at the end of the game. The characters are older, grizzled, and dealing with an intense threat, but they remain steadfast and together. Record scratch, you're probably wondering how I got myself into this situation kinda deal. We then rewind to the second stage of the intro, which shows Noctis and his entourage leaving the city of Insomnia as he embarks on a rural road trip to meet with his bride-to-be, Luna Freya the Oracle, and do his duty by entering into a political arranged marriage with her. The scene is a great little indicator of a strained relationship Noctis has with his father, and intrigue is immediately built. You wonder what got the two of them to become so distant from one another, and expect the game to give you a satisfying story of a strained familial relationship like Final Fantasy X. Spoilers, it doesn't, but the promise is certainly there. We're judging this based on the intro, not how good the payoff to the intro is down the line. We then move on to Stage 3 of the intro. The beautiful royal car that Noctis and his companions were traveling in has broken down in the middle of the desert, and the only solution to the problem is to work together and push the car to the nearest gas station, while an excellent rendition of Stand By Me, performed by Florence and the Machine, plays in the background. This part of the game isn't a cutscene. No, you, the player, actually have to push the car alongside your friends as they all bicker and complain about the situation. It's absolutely fantastic, and it's the best part of the intro. The three introductory pieces feel a little disjointed when paired together, like Final Fantasy XII's intro, because of the continual shifts in tone, but it succeeds far better than XII's intro for a number of reasons, the least of which is that each individual segment is actually good. Part 1 is cool because there's a battle showing the main cast, and offers a promise of the epic scope of the adventure you're about to undertake. Part 2 helps actually begin to set up the stakes at hand, and offers you real insight into character goals and personalities. It offers exposition, characterization, and the beginning of thematic exploration. However, both parts 1 and 2 end up feeling a little bit rushed, and aren't quite as strong as they could be. Conceptually they are good, but they don't get much time to breathe, and in a way it feels like the devs couldn't decide which of these three intros were the best, so they just stuck all of them together, rather than just picking one. Part 3 of the intro, however, is fantastic. It shows character rapport and charm. It's quirky and unique, but perfectly sets up the idea that the game is a road trip journey with friends, and it's ultimately about the bonds of friendship and how those are everlasting. It's incredibly relatable, and it's complemented by a song that perfectly encapsulates that theme, but beyond that, it's a fantastic, bombastic rendition of the song that adds both a sense of humor and sincerity to the situation, in the same way one jokes with their friends, but then follows up said joke by telling those friends that they love them. While 15's intro is a little messy, like the rest of the game, it has a lot of heart. It ends strong and helps set up the road trip well. Number 11, Final Fantasy XI. Final Fantasy XI's in-game intro is actually very similar to Final Fantasy I's in-game intro. You get a little bit of a text scroll, and then you're just plopped into the world, and I will readily admit that the opening arc of Final Fantasy I, fighting Garland and saving the princess, is far more interesting than the opening missions of Final Fantasy XI. However, the opening CG cutscene for Final Fantasy XI is incredible. It's 7 minutes long, and is more of a short film with a narrative arc than just a mere intro to a game. Final Fantasy XI begins 30 years after the nation of Winders, Bastok, Sandoria, and Juno battled the Beastmen armies of the Shadow Lord, and the intro showcases a small piece of that conflict. It begins with a lore dump giving exposition of the world and the conflict, but it's done in a much more coherent manner than Final Fantasy XII's botched attempt. The CG animation is beautiful, as to be expected, and the scope is grand as we enjoy a fantastic musical score. However, the grand scope then zooms in, and we see the very personal struggle of a pair of children. They're siblings, Aldo and Emmeline, refugees of war just trying to survive this brutal conflict. The Beastmen come to invade the stronghold that the children and other refugees are hiding out in, and the pair of siblings run for their lives. They see an escape, but it's too tall for both of them to reach, so the older sister Emmeline boosts her brother up so he can escape, leaving her to meet her fate against the Beastmen alone. It's horrifying and dark, truly tragic, but also beautiful to see such a deep connection of love and willingness to sacrifice for family. Those of us with close sibling bonds that have undergone hardship will resonate very deeply with this intro. It's incredibly powerful and accomplishes a lot within a short amount of time. The intro is a great short story by itself, and if this wasn't an MMO, this would be our introduction to our main character, Aldo. Aldo is an important character in Final Fantasy XI's world, but this intro makes him seem like he'll play a way bigger role in the main story than he actually does. Still, it's fantastic. After Aldo escapes, the game does a flash forward to an era of peace where an army of adventurers gather, implying the sense of community you're about to experience as you go through the realm of Vana'diel. It's not quite as dangerous as it may have been in the era of the Shadow Lord. We now live in an era of optimism, but it is only because all these heroes are united to make the world a better place. Thus is the intro to Final Fantasy XI. I'll admit, the tag on at the end with the army of adventurers doesn't do too much for me, but the entire arc between the siblings is fantastic and makes for a very memorable intro, showing that Final Fantasy XI does care about storytelling. Don't let the early game fool you. There's plenty of great story in 11, and the intro is just a small hint of what lies within the game if you give it a chance. The intro movie promises you a Final Fantasy experience, which is something 11 needed to do with its drastic shift in gameplay. And through the intro, the player is immediately given confidence that yes, this is Final Fantasy. Number 10, Final Fantasy II. The intro to Final Fantasy II has been expanded over the years, but each expansion has actually made the opening sequence of the game progressively better, and what's more, they all tie together perfectly. We'll begin with the opening cinematic showing the ever-powerful Emperor Mateus before we shift to the village of Fynn under attack. We see our heroes fighting for their lives against the overwhelming might of the Empire in a pretty solid action set piece that lives up to the glory of the PS1 Final Fantasy era. This addition was added to the PlayStation port of the game. If you're playing the PSP version, after the CG cutscene, you move on to a cinematic of in-game graphics, providing a little bit of exposition about the state of the world in a succinct and easy-to-understand way. The tying together of the visuals and text help give content to the world and story so you immediately understand what's going on without confusion. The scene is clear and to the point, but doesn't talk down to the player either. It's just a nice bit of extra exposition to set the stage. Then we finally move on to the original game's intro, which is the 4 heroes from the opening cutscene fleeing from the Empire after the village had been destroyed. When our heroes find themselves surrounded by the Empire's soldiers, they enter into the game's first battle, which is impossible for the player to win. It's one of the earliest scripted battles in a JRPG, and perfectly melds gameplay mechanics and storytelling to show you how much more powerful the Empire is than the player characters, and the kind of odds you'll need to overcome on this intense journey. The power dynamics and states are immediately set in the opening battle. What a great start to a game. The entire sequence is a fantastic opening hook to the story, and is generally underrated in the Final Fantasy community. The original opening was already one of the stronger ones in the series, but with the additions added in the PS1 and PSP versions of the game, Final Fantasy II's intro is actually extremely competitive and showcases how to get a player immediately hooked into a story. It's a fantastic intro. Number 9. Final Fantasy VI. First off, the CG intro for the PS1 version of Final Fantasy VI isn't too great, so I'm going to be mostly ignoring it. It really doesn't add much to the game, so instead I'll be focusing on the in-game intro sequence. We begin with the lore dump regarding the state of the world and the Empire. When comparing it to Final Fantasy II's lore dump, I actually prefer 2's because of the more dynamic music choices. 6's usage of a sepia tone look at the beginning here makes me feel a bit of a disconnect with the events on screen, and the camera pans are too quick for me to be able to savor what's being told to me. But unlike 12's intro, 6's intro is very straightforward and easy to understand, and it's far easier to gravitate towards. The lore dump in 6 doesn't do much for me, but I don't think it's bad either. The intro really starts to get good once we're introduced to Biggs, Wedge, and Terra. The soldiers begin discussing their mission and talk about the witch they have with them, and how she's being mind-controlled by a slave crown. This immediately builds intrigue, and you wonder about how much latent power this mysterious girl has. You consider the ramifications of mind control technology, and massive robots powered by magic, and the lore dump that just happened previously all of a sudden feels far more weighty and important. A whirlwind of possibilities and questions dance through your mind, and then, the Magitech armors begin to walk through the snow towards their destination as the iconic music begins to play. Iconic is a good word to describe the scene of Magitech armor walking through the snow. This was considered the peak of video game cinematics on the Super Nintendo, and I'll admit, coming from Final Fantasy VII and looking backwards, I wasn't too impressed with it from a visual standpoint upon first playing. Or rather, I thought the armor walking through the snow was fine, but it was a bit repetitive and went on for too long for my tastes. I still largely feel the same way about the sequence. I like it better than I did then, but I still think it goes on for too long and is a little overhyped. It's like the Beatles song I Want You, parentheses, She's So Heavy. At the end of the song they just repeat the same riff over and over again. I like the riff, but it goes on for too long. If there was something that changed it up, like maybe a ripping guitar solo to keep things interesting, then I'd be able to appreciate it more. But it's just the same thing over and over again. That's how I feel with the Magitech armor walking through the snow. It's just a bit too repetitive. But looking at the 3 pieces of the intro as a whole, I truly believe that Final Fantasy VI offers a fantastic introduction to the game. Enough exposition is offered so you can immediately grasp some of the important basic concepts about the world you're entering, but at the same time it offers enticing mysteries that make you want to keep going and explore what that world has to offer. It's the best of both worlds in a way, and 6 is in many ways about duality. If not in thematic concept, then definitely in design philosophy, especially regarding the first and second half of the game. The fact that the intro balances both exposition and mystery is another example of this design philosophy entering every aspect of the game, and it allows for a fantastic introductory sequence. Number 8. Final Fantasy XIV. Every ending is just another beginning, or so the expression says. While the intro for Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 was just a generic hype trailer for the game, A Realm Reborn's opening cinematic shows the fiery in-game ending of 1.0 in a hyper-stylized and dramatic manner. Final Fantasy XIV, for those who don't know, launched to near universal derision and was hated by critics and fans alike. The solution the devs came up with was unheard of, remaking the game from the ground up. In order for the remake to make narrative sense, with the terrain of locations changing drastically between versions of the game, the devs came up with an in-game story event where the literal apocalypse rained down fire and brimstone upon the world of Final Fantasy XIV. Players who were active at the time could play through the event, but for the rest of us, we got this cool cutscene showing the events of that epic final battle, and the heroes of that era being teleported 5 years into the future after the conflict to help protect the realm again. Visually, the cinematic is absolutely stunning. The music is fantastic. It does a good job of showing the intensity of that moment, giving it a big sense of dramatic weight and importance. The opening also shows the different parties of major characters involved, and it immediately makes the player want to know who all these people are, what their role in this conflict was, and where they are today. The cutscene helps paint the original 14 and its events almost as legend and myth, the kind of story you hear whispers about but could never experience yourself, and you want to see how this legend affects the modern day. It's an incredible hook and creative use of a bad situation. A Realm Reborn's intro sequence is a fantastic beginning to Final Fantasy XIV in the current day. It showcases incredible storytelling creativity alongside some of the most stunning visuals ever produced for a video game. It's truly something special. Number 7. Final Fantasy Tactics. We begin by showing a historian explain that he has discovered some hidden history about a war long in the past, and how one of history's footnotes was perhaps a far more important figure than those with power would want you to know. The idea of discovering the history of a lost hero suppressed by political powers is a great hook, especially knowing that this is who you'll be playing as in the game. We then move to the era of this lost hero. Final Fantasy Tactics has 2 different opening cinematics, one for the PlayStation version of the game, and one for the PSP version of the game. Both have great music and visuals with a strong sense of theatrical quality and visual storytelling. They're ultimately different takes on the same scene, but both work very well. You see different individuals riding on chocobos across Ivalice, and you wonder who these individuals are and where they are headed. They look important, and the cinematography and music make you feel their intensity. Whatever is going on is clearly important and of the highest of stakes, but we don't know what that is yet. Mystery and interest build immediately, and it's all without a single line of dialogue. It's a fantastic use of music and visuals to bring someone into a story, but it's not style over substance, as the exact point of the intro is to evoke specific feelings that are later enhanced by more traditional storytelling. It's a great beginning. Like other games in the series, the intro to Tactics is a bit extended beyond just an out-of-engine cutscene. We see our lost hero, Ramza, and we see him attempt to defend the Princess of Ivalice from a kidnapping plot in the game's prologue battle, but ultimately failing in his goal to prevent her abduction. We see the man from the intro cinematic, Ramza's old friend Delita, whom he had long thought dead, and finally, we flash back to a time when Ramza and Delita were the best of friends, and the story truly begins. We have so many great storytelling hooks right here at the beginning. What role did Ramza play in history? What happened between these two friends that would take them on such different paths? Why did Ramza think Delita to be dead? Why is there so much interest in abducting the princess? The game has given you a lot of questions to ask, and all of them are important to the core story. It's dramatic and interesting right from the very beginning, and is an incredibly strong way to open up the game. There's a lot going on in this intro, but it's all executed to perfection. Final Fantasy Tactics has a truly great introduction sequence. Number 6. Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX very much has a slow burn introduction, and one could argue it has the longest introductory sequence of any of the main games, unless you're one of those folks who argues that the entirety of A Realm Reborn is an introductory sequence. Final Fantasy IX is one of the rare games in the series where the start screen will actually provide some immediate characterization for the player if they linger long enough. As you continue to idle on the start screen, screenshots of the different playable characters will appear alongside quotes, telling you something about the personality of the character. It's a great way to immediately begin to paint a picture in your mind about the kind of people the cast are, how they're different, how they see the world, and how they interact with others. When you actually start the game, we move on to the opening cinematic, which itself is fine, but nothing to write home about. There's not quite enough context given to make the events on screen mean much, and it's not mysterious enough to build an overwhelming sense of interest like other entries in the series. We then briefly play as our main character Zidane for a quick battle, and we find out that he is part of a group of thieves hired to kidnap Princess Garnet of Alexandria. We then shift to playing as the young black mage Vivi, exploring the streets of Alexandria, trying to get into the play that Zidane's group of thieves is using as a cover for their kidnapping plot. As you explore Alexandria and become sucked into the charm of the world, eventually you switch to playing as the bumbling Steiner, captain of Alexandria's Royal Knights, who would do anything in his power to protect the princess from any dastardly plots. You continue to switch perspectives between these different characters, exploring different parts of Alexandria and its castle, until all four meet up in a joyous combination of chaos, comedy, and swashbuckling adventure. The intro is full of character and charm, taking time to set up the different dynamics so that when they intersect, the full impact of such is felt, and it's done in a way that's just so darn fun. It's a feel-good intro that sets the stage for a grand adventure. It may be a slow burn, and isn't initially full of much action, but when it gets to the action, it's grand and puts a big smile on your face. A great, great intro. Number 5. Final Fantasy IV. The CG intro to the PS1 version of the game is meh. The 3D remake intro is pretty awesome and full of hype, showcasing fantastic renderings of the characters and some of the game's most iconic moments. Honestly, I could watch the CG intro all day. It's really, really awesome. It's just showing how cool the characters look in 3D with awesome music, but it works really, really well. However, the reason Final Fantasy IV's intro ranks so high has nothing to do with those CG intros, which feel so disconnected that they almost don't even count in my book. When I'm talking about the intro of Final Fantasy IV, I'm talking about the real intro of the game. We see airships flying through the air as we hear the theme of the Red Wings. We go aboard one of the airships to see the Dark Knight Cecil, captain of the Red Wings, questioned by his crew for their atrocious war crimes against the mages of Mysidia. We flash back to see Cecil lead his men in an invasion of Mysidia and steal their magical crystal. Cecil returns to the present moment and shouts down his men, claiming they are not to question the orders of the king. But it's clear that this is just an act. Cecil is as distraught, if not more so, than his men. The guilt begins to eat at his soul, and it is from there that Cecil begins his arc of redemption for his past sins, trying to right the wrongs he has done. From the very beginning of the game we meet our hero, but at this point in the journey, he is not a hero. He is a Dark Knight. He is a villain. He is the Darth Vader that makes innocents flee in terror. We are playing as that Darth Vader. But there is a greater sense of nobility to Cecil, and his strong desire to be better and uphold true justice is what sets him out on his path of redemption. The great music, visuals, and strong character work makes for an iconic intro that still holds up to this day. Final Fantasy IV has one of the strongest intros in the series because it is focused on, above all else, character, and it paints a brilliant portrait right out of the gate. Number 4, Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIII has two opening cinematics. One acting as a trailer full of highlights of the game, while another is the actual beginning of the game's story. While I like both, I'm only going to be focusing on the in-game intro for the purposes of this ranking and discussion. Final Fantasy XIII's intro is an en media res action set piece, similar to the beginning of Final Fantasy VII's intro in a number of ways. We begin by seeing soldiers escorting mysterious hooded figures on a train and talking of a purge. Suddenly, one of the hooded figures begins to fight against the soldiers in an attempt to save the civilians. We don't know who she is, but she looks incredibly cool. The action is awesome, the visuals are stunning, and the music is top-notch. We see another character comforting other victims of the purge. He assures them that he's not a l'Cie, and that they're on the same side. Intrigue continues to build. Why are these people being purged? What kind of totalitarian government is this? What is a l'Cie, and why are they so dangerous? Who is the badass pink-haired girl? There's not time to breathe yet and answer these questions, because we've got a giant scorpion robot to fight. This intro is pure hype, baby, keeping you excited to see what's next and immediately offering you some strong hooks. Striking characters, great action, a conflict you want to know more about, and some mysteries to unravel. One could argue that 13 didn't launch well off this intro sequence into properly addressing the questions it set up in a satisfactory way, but it's hard to argue that the intro doesn't offer a great first impression. It immediately wows with its cinematic presentation, great action, great visuals, and great intrigue. Nobody likes seeing a group of innocents purged, so seeing someone stand against an oppressive regime is an immediate dopamine hit. You want to know about the struggle, and you want to see the hero succeed, and the game wastes no time in getting you into a fight with a cool-looking robot. It's a great start to a Final Fantasy game and one of the best in the series. Number 3, Final Fantasy VIII. The intro to Final Fantasy VIII is basically just the music video for Liberale Fatale. That said, Liberale Fatale is one of the strongest musical tracks in the entire series. Like if someone heard the scores for Beauty and the Beast and Sweeney Todd, combined them with Wagner, and then gave them to Jim Steinman, who said it needs to be about 80% more epic, and that's the vibe you get from the track. It's one of the most epic pieces of music you'll ever hear in your entire life. Paired with the amazing music is mysterious text on screen making you feel like there is going to be some deep emotional struggle over the course of the game. Imagery of different foreshadowing flashes across the screen like a fever dream. We see a girl in blue and a mysterious woman in black before a series of flash cuts leading to the title. It's incredibly 90s and is akin to the over-the-top Baz Luhrmann frantic Romeo and Juliet adaptation with its melodramatic teenage romance and hyper-fast MTV cuts. It's pure hype, and then we get to see two characters duke it out in an epic sword battle. The music continues to heighten, and we figure that we are witness to one of the most important battles in history. Whatever is going on here will determine the fate of the world. It's a matter of life or death. Everything is on the line, and the fight continues to pick up intensity. The battle reaches its climax, and we see rapid-fire images of what is to come in the game, ending just before the mysterious man in black and the woman in blue can embrace. And then the title appears, again. It's so damn cool! Shortly after, you'll find out the big epic fight you just saw was a sparring match between two classmates that got a little out of hand, and you'll spend a bunch of time just hanging out in a high school that looks like a mall with the most chill music in the world. The intro cinematic to Final Fantasy VIII makes a lot of sense as to why it was added, because the intro afterwards of just hanging out at school is really, really slow, especially after the bombastic, pun not intended, of the previous game in the series. So they made a super hype 90s music video opening to promise you, trust us, this game will be epic, dramatic, and really cool. So you don't immediately turn it off when one of the first things you do in the game is go to a classroom and find out you need to take some exams. So, VIII's intro is a bit of a bait and switch, and intentionally deceptive in a number of ways. However, judging it based solely on the intro, not knowing the context of what comes immediately after, it's really great. It's a fever dream 90s music video for Liberale Fatale, and it's really, really cool. It doesn't matter how off the rails VIII may fall in a number of ways, the intro is fantastic and builds an insane amount of hype. Number 2, Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X's intro is, quite simply, amazing. It goes the opposite route of Final Fantasy VIII in terms of bombast, but both intros are similar in a number of ways. Both are heavily reliant around great music building a sense of atmosphere, and both are foreshadowing of events to come in the game, acting as a promise of what's to come. However, in the case of Final Fantasy X, instead of showing you a montage of different snippets to promise the kind of emotions you'll feel, Final Fantasy X opens with an actual scene you'll later get to experience in the game, and is more truthful than Final Fantasy VIII about the journey you're about to embark upon. The bittersweet piano melodies of two Xanarkin play as we see our heroes gathered around a campfire. They look tired and exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. They've gone through something harrowing, and it looks like it isn't over yet. There's a somber sense of sadness consuming the scene, and it feels like the cast has been through hell. Our male lead puts his hand on our female lead's shoulder. It's clear that these two have some kind of deep connection, and his attempt at comfort is soothing, but not enough. The male lead climbs up to look over the horizon at something that looks both grand and beautiful, but also dangerous. Like a siren call, it looks both inviting and harrowing. The worst of the journey has yet to come, it seems. Then we hear our male lead speak. He says, "Listen to my story. It may be our last chance." Things are dire, and it looks like our heroes are at their breaking point, and you immediately want to know what's going on. Who are these people? How are they related? Where are they going? What hardships did they endure to get there? And what's waiting for them over that horizon? Is there any chance for them to make it through, or will you, the player, simply be playing out a Shakespearean tragedy? The intro to Final Fantasy X is emotionally powerful, and like Final Fantasy VI, an incredible showcase for the technology of the day. However, unlike VI, the cinematic intro doesn't drag on for far too long, and offers great emotional beats, at least for me. The storytelling hooks in this intro are simply fantastic, and for me, it's the second best intro in the series. It's amazing. Number 1, Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII's intro is iconic. It begins with what looks like the stars and the cosmos, but it's revealed to be loose electricity coming from a broken wire. We see the face of Aerith, who seems to be looking at this electricity with some kind of deeper meaning. She walks out of the alley, and the camera pans out to show how massive the city of Midgar is, and then we zoom back into a train racing on the tracks. When it screeches to a halt, the action immediately begins. The music intensifies as members of the eco-terrorist group Avalanche jump out of the train and begin fighting the guards of the Mako reactor power plant. The leader of the group shouts, "Come on, newcomer, follow me." As you attempt to follow, you engage in your first battle. You haven't even gotten a chance to name your character yet, but the game tells you something about him. You're labeled as ex-soldier, but soldier is in all caps. What does that mean? You reconvene with the other members of the team. Through dialogue, you learn that soldier is an elite military force that works for Shinra, an electric power company with governmental control over most of the planet, an enemy of the eco-terrorist group Avalanche. What's an ex-soldier doing with them? You find out Cloud is a mercenary, just doing the job for money. Barrett, leader of Avalanche, refuses to trust this former enemy, and there's an immediate sense of tension in the group. What follows is an action-packed set piece of climbing through the reactor, great world building, and character setup, planting a bomb, getting some interesting foreshadowing about the potential of Cloud being an unreliable narrator, battling a giant robot, and rushing to escape the reactor before the bomb inside goes off. In media res doesn't always work, but it works brilliantly with the bombing mission in Final Fantasy VII. The camera work is on par with a Hollywood blockbuster. It wastes no time getting into the action, and it immediately sets up the world, character personalities, and relationships. It's exciting, bombastic, atmospheric, mysterious, intriguing, and epic all at the same time, all while propelled by consistently amazing music. It's by far the best opening to any Final Fantasy game, and an easy winner for first place. Thanks for watching this video. Again, these lists are my personal opinion, and I'm definitely curious to see you guys posting your rankings in the comments below. Be sure to do the YouTube things, the liking, the subscribing, etc. And if you like this video, don't forget to check out the other rankings in the series. Thanks for watching, and I hope you find peace and happiness in your life. Cheers!